Hey gamers, Chris here, and today we are going to be talking about Hexblade. Specifically, what I want to talk about is how good is a Hexblade on their own, because conventional wisdom is kind of that Hexblade makes a great dip, or even a pretty good multi-class, but maybe not so good as a single class. And when we're talking about Hexblades, we tend to think about melee characters, or maybe even Eldritch Blast character that just sits back and relies on agonizing blast and hex for damage on their Eldritch Blast spells, and those are okay. But today, what I want to do is I want to talk about doing a straight class Hexblade in a way that I think is a lot of fun, and it takes advantage of a specific kind of strategy we often use called crit fishing. So when we make a crit fishing character, number one, what we want to do is we want to make a character that's going to score a lot of critical hits. And number two, we want a character that can really capitalize on those critical hits to do a lot of damage. Now, when we make a character that uses Eldritch Blast, we can get those critical hits reasonably often by a number of different combinations, but actually scoring a lot of damage on those critical hits isn't very good. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at what you can do with a Hexblade with a bow. And I think this is a really effective combination. So stick around. We're going to talk about that. Welcome to Treantmonk's Temple. So before we get into this, let's talk a little bit about Warlocks. Because one thing we have to keep in mind when we make this character is there's certain limitations and strategies that are different for a Warlock than they are for, say, other spellcasters. The main thing is Pact magic. Now, Pact magic works differently in that, number one, you get them back on a short rest, and number two, they're always cast at your highest spell slot level up to 5th level spells. But you don't get very many of them. At first level, you only get one spell, though if you think about it, if you're taking, say, a couple short rests, that's actually more spells than you would get with a other primary spellcaster. And then it goes to 2 slots at level 2. Again, that ends up being quite a few spell slots. But that stays at 2 right to 10th level. It's not till 11th level you even get your 3rd slot. So by then you're talking about a lot less spells than other spellcasters. Now, we can mitigate that with cantrips. We can also mitigate that with invocations, because invocations can give us additional spells. They can also sometimes give us spells we can cast over and over and over again. But it's important to think about that when we use our Pact spells. And with this character, we're going to have a use for those Pact spells that isn't going to necessarily be spellcasting. So we're going to have to be really careful in the tactics of this character to make it work right. But when it does work right, it's so much fun, and I think you'll really enjoy it. The second thing I want to talk about is the level 6 ability of the Hexblade. It's called Accursed Specter. And what this will do is it will allow you to raise a specter up when you kill a humanoid. Now, immediately, you should understand this is going to be somewhat circumstantial, because how often are you killing humanoids? Well, in some campaigns, all the time. They might be the enemies that you're facing and you're fighting them all the time. In other campaigns, maybe not so much. That means either your character has to be some kind of vicious murderer that sneaks into the village at night and kills people, but I don't think you necessarily have to be evil. There's other ways you can play this too. You got to think about it in terms of character concept. One thing I thought of is maybe something like the Punisher, who goes out and he finds the evildoers and he slaughters them, and then he raises them as specters. Still not a good action, but maybe there's a way to look at that as kind of the dark hero. But of course, if you're crawling in a dungeon for months on end, you may not have access to any humanoids, so that's something to keep in mind. Now, when you use this ability, you get a specter who will follow your orders all day. And a specter is quite useful because they're incorporeal. And that means they can look through walls, into chests for you. They can do scouting that normally you couldn't do. On the other hand, they can't speak. Now, if I'm a DM, and actually, although I usually talk about player options, I tend to actually be behind the screen more than I'm in front of it. And by the screen, I mean the DM screen, and I mean that metaphorically, because I never use a DM screen, ever. And I'll probably talk about that in some video in the future. But if I am the DM, This is beautiful. You're going to love the Accursed Specter ability if your players have it, because there's so many different ways that you can have fun with a character using this ability. The first is that the Specter can't speak. So the characters have to be able to communicate with his Specter without having it speak back to them. So it understands their language, but then you get to do things like maybe try to use gestures or some kind of signs, or maybe you're doing actions, and so you can really get in on the role playing too, and that can be a lot of fun. The second thing is there is no reason to think this Specter is loyal. It's forced to obey commands, but if you think about it, it's been raised up of a creature that the Hexblade has killed. So how much fun is that? Think about how you could play this when it's forced to obey the commands of a player, but it wants to subvert them. So for a DM, I think this is a lot of fun, and for a player too. Not always the most powerful ability to my understanding, and in Unearthed Arcana, when they were first playtesting the Hexblade, it was a more powerful ability, but I think it's a fun ability, and I think it could be a lot of good role playing for both the DM and for the players. And I'm not going to talk a lot about it as it comes up with the character. The main thing to know is you get a Specter, lasts a day, you have to kill somebody to get it, and this Specter is reasonably useful. It's a little bit boosted from the Hexblade, but it's not a super powerful creature. Obviously, with action economy, this can be useful to you. It can be an additional way to do a little bit more damage. There's scouting ability with it, so it's not a useless ability. It's still a useful ability, but I think it's limited in its power. The final thing I want to talk about before we get started on the build is what this build is all based around. And it's based around an invocation called Eldritch Smite. Eldritch Smite is a 5th level invocation, meaning you can take it at 5th level or higher, and requires Pact of the Blade. The way it works is once per turn, when you hit a creature with your Pact weapon, you can expend a Warlock spell slot to deal 1d8 extra damage of force, plus an additional 1d8 per level of the spell. Now remember that with Pact magic, that's automatically at your highest level possible. So a 9th level Warlock is doing this as a 5th level Smite. So that's 6d8 damage. It's force damage. Now the idea here is that the Pact weapon doesn't have to be a melee weapon, and that is a big deal. That's the main difference between this ability and a Paladin Smite, is we can now use it with a ranged weapon. Finally, the creature is knocked prone. If it's huge or smaller, that means it's going to, number one, have reduced movement on the next turn because it's going to be using half its movement to get up. Number two, your allies can have advantage on it if they're attacking in melee. But this Eldritch Smite is going to use up our Pact spells. Remember that although we're going to have all kinds of Pact spells, we're not going to be able to cast a lot of them because we're really going to be counting on using this Eldritch Smite to apply to a critical. And when we apply to a critical, of course, then it's doubled. So that same 9th level Warlock hitting a creature with an Eldritch Smite will be adding 12d8 force damage to that attack on top of the regular critical hit damage. One last thing I want to mention is, although in the past I've always done builds up to level 20, this build is really going to come into its prime around level 12. And I think we're just going to stop there. At level 12, this is lovely. And I'll give you some ideas what you might want to do if you continue this to level 20. But we're really going to concentrate on the build up to level 12. And so if you are one of those people who are playing in a campaign that doesn't go to level 20, this is a really good option because this is something that's going to play well at lower levels. It starts becoming really effective around level 5, and then it will stay really effective to level 12. So you have a nice big window there where this is going to be a really strong character for you. So here's our character sheet, and as you can see, we're going to call it the Hexblade Spellbow, and we're not using any homebrew content or anything like that. Now, when it comes to race for this character, I really am going to recommend one option. I think it's really strong. Now, you could do something like an Eladrin to make this work, but I love the half-elf. The half-elf is giving you that +2 to charisma, plus +1 to 2 other ability scores, which we can put in our dexterity and constitution. So these are nice ability score boosts for us. And there's a specific kind of half-elf that I think works. It's one of the half-elf variants, and we're going to look specifically at the drow half-elf. So here's the drow half-elf. As you can see, we get our +2 charisma, our +1 to 2 other ability scores, our dark vision, our fey ancestry, our skill versatility, but we're going to give up the skill versatility. The skill versatility is where you get the 2 additional skills known. We give that up to get Drow Magic. And Drow Magic will give us the Dancing Lights cantrip, which isn't a big deal, but I'll always take another cantrip. When you reach 3rd level, you can cast the Fairy Fire spell once with this trait, and regain the ability when you take a long rest. Now that's not specifically geared towards this particular character, but Fairy Fire is a lovely buff. You can cast it on your enemies, even a group of enemies, get advantage on attacking them. You can also make them visible if they were invisible, or make it impossible for them to turn invisible or to hide. So all kinds of useful stuff with Fairy Fire. It's a good spell. But the big thing here is when you reach 5th level, you can cast the Darkness spell once with this trait and regain the ability to do so when you finish a long rest. So what this will allow us to do is it'll allow us to cast the Darkness spell without using Pact magic, and that's really important. Now there will become a certain level where we won't rely on the Darkness spell anymore, but once we get to 5th level, the Darkness spell is the way we're going to go for our crit fishing. So as a half-elf, we get our ability score increase, we get our +2 to charisma, we're going to take 2 additional ability score increases, which we're going to put in constitution and dexterity. We also get an additional language, doesn't matter which one you take. With a half-elf, I like to have undercommon. So now we're going to do our ability scores, and I'm going to be using the point buy for this one. You can use the standard array, and this will still be pretty good, except you won't be able to get quite as high a constitution modifier as we will with the point buy. With the point buy, it's just a little bit better. First thing we're going to do is we're going to pump our constitution all the way up to 15. Including the +2 from half-elf, that gives us a 17. Now, normally with beginning characters, 16 is good enough, but because we're going to be going after the Elven accuracy feat, the 17 works nicely here because it allows us at level 4 to take that feat and still get our charisma up to 18. We're then going to make our dexterity a 13. That's going to allow us to wear medium armor and still get the best possible armor class. And then we're going to bump our constitution up to 15 as well. Now that plus the +1 we're getting gives us a 16 constitution, which is a great starting constitution for this character. That means better concentration saves as well as more hit points. Now we have 4 points remaining, and we can put them wherever we want. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and put 10 in intelligence and 10 in wisdom. I like to have a 10 intelligence. I hate playing a character that I think is below average intelligence. So that's just a role-playing thing for me. If we're going straight optimization, I guess I'd probably go for a wisdom of 12. Now we're going to go into our class selection. And we're going to select Warlock. And the otherworldly patron we're going to select is the Hexblade. I get 2 starting proficiencies. Now this is a charisma-based character, so I'm inclined to take charisma skills. So let's go ahead and take Deception and Intimidation. Now let's go into our spell selection. The first spell I'm going to take is Booming Blade. Now, as an archer, I'm eventually not going to be using Booming Blade, but at level 1, I'm not going to be much of an archer, and I'm going to need to be able to switch into melee when I need to. Booming Blade gives me an option in melee to just do a little bit more damage, so we might as well take it. We've got the spot for it on our cantrip list. It's a good pick. If you like Green Flame Blade, it works here just as well. The next cantrip I'm going to pick is Minor Illusion. I've talked about this lots of times. It's a great spell, useful for creating obscurement, useful for distracting enemies, and then there's lots of versatile use to it as well. That brings us to our first level spell selections. Now, with a Warlock, what we want to do is we're going to start out with first level spells, and as we level up, we're probably going to dump them, because we're not going to want to cast a lot of first level spells with higher level slots, and that's essentially what happens when you play a full Warlock. But at level 1 and level 2, I like to just have a nice combination of attack and defense. So that gives me 2 options. The first I'll take is Shield. Shield's available specifically because we're a Hexblade. Shield is a fantastic defensive spell. Gives you a +5 AC for an entire round. And it only uses your reaction. So with our medium armor and our decent dexterity and a shield spell, we can expect to be able to get a pretty good armor class at need. The second spell I'm going to take is Hex. Hex is kind of a classic for Warlocks. When you make an attack roll and you hit, you do an additional D6 necrotic damage to the target. It's a bonus action to cast. It lasts an hour, which means that in most cases, when you're doing multiple encounters in a day, you're going to be able to use this for multiple encounters. Now, it's going to use our concentration, but we do have a decent armor class, and we do have a strong constitution modifier, which means our concentration isn't easy to break. Now we're going to select our background. And I'm kind of thinking if this is going to be kind of a hunter style character, and I'm kind of envisioning it that way as a dark hunter, I'm kind of thinking the urban bounty hunter might be an interesting idea. This is a very flexible selection. Take what you want to take here. Now I get 2 proficiencies from a very limited list. I'm liking persuasion, and I am liking stealth. Now I should note this leaves this particular character without the perception skill, which is a skill I normally like to have. Remember that we can modify backgrounds. We can also choose a different background if you want. Pick, the kind of the standard pick is sailor if you want to get perception, but you can also pick any background that duplicates some of the skills you already have, and you can select something else. So if you took something like, say, criminal, you could use it by duplicating deception, or anything that is intimidation, you could use it and grab perception. I'm going to stick with urban bounty hunter just because I'm kind of feeling a concept for this character, and I just want to kind of go with that. I get 2 tool proficiencies. One available option is Thieves' Tool, so that's kind of a no-brainer. And then the second one, there's nothing here that looks too great. I'll just go ahead and take playing cards. So here's our starting equipment. What we're going to do is, first off, light crossbow and 20 bolts will work just fine as a ranged option when we need it. I can choose a component pouch or an arcane focus. I'll always take the component pouch of those 2 options. And I can choose a scholar's pack or a dungeoneer's pack. I prefer the dungeoneer's pack. And then I can choose leather armor, any simple weapon, and 2 daggers. So we'll grab that, and we'll grab a spear. So now let's talk about what kind of equipment we want to have. And you won't be able to afford this right at level 1 at starting, but usually by level 2 or level 3, there's nothing too extravagant we're going to go for here. And you're going to see that we can get this character into a ranged character reasonably quickly. We're still not going to be a great archer till level 5, but we can be a decent one. First thing we want to get is a hand crossbow. Hand crossbow is going to give us a ranged option that does okay damage, and it allows us to use our Hexblade weapon on it, meaning we will be able to use our charisma for attack and damage with that. The ideal armor at this point would be half plate. Now half plate's pretty expensive, but until you can afford that, the cheap option you could do is scale mail. Scale mail will give you a +4 to AC, plus your +2 from dexterity, means a 16 armor class, which isn't bad for a character who's not using a shield. And then once we can get that to a half plate, that's going to go up to a 17. Finally, sometimes we might get stuck in melee, especially at lower levels. And if we're using our hand crossbow as our hex weapon, then whatever we use in melee isn't going to have that bonus, which means we probably want it to be based off our dex. But we will have martial weapon proficiency, which means a rapier is a good pick for your backup melee weapon. So Hexblade is what we often refer to as front-loaded, which means it gets a little more at the beginning than most other characters receive. Usually Warlocks receive 1 extra ability at level 1, but a Hexblade for some reason gets more than that, and it's good stuff. So here's what you get. Number 1, you get the Hexblade Curse, and this is something we're really going to be using right through this entire character's career. Starting at first level, you gain the ability to place a baleful curse on somebody. As a bonus action, choose 1 creature you can see within 30 feet of you. Now that 30-foot range is significant. Now with a hand crossbow, we're looking at a 30-foot short range anyway, so we're looking at staying within that 30-foot range of our enemies. This isn't an archer where we're going to want to be hundreds of feet away like we are with some other kinds of archers, especially ones with Sharpshooter. But this one is really about kind of getting reasonably close, but using the bow. That's still going to give us a fair bit of advantage in terms of maneuverability and being able to pick out the opponents we want to pick out, but there are some limitations there to keep mind of, especially when we plan to use the Hexblade Curse ability. The target is cursed for 1 minute. That means it's probably going to last for 1 combat. The curse ends early if the target dies, you die, or you're incapacitated. Until the curse ends, these are your benefits. You gain bonus to damage rolls against the cursed target equal to your proficiency bonus. So this is a scaling damage bonus. So when we're looking at a character that wants to do lots of damage, that's just a good thing. Any attack roll you make against the cursed target is a critical hit on a roll of 19 or 20 on the d20. This is key. This is the main ability that's going to allow us to increase our chance of doing criticals. If the cursed target dies, you regain hit points equal to your Warlock level plus your Charisma modifier. This is okay. It's not a great ability, but I'll always take a little bit of healing if it's free. And we can use this ability once per short rest or long rest. So this means we can use this multiple times a day, but we need to be careful where we use it. We want to use this on the tougher bad guys. And then the second ability we get at first level is actually two abilities mixed into one. Number one, we're going to gain proficiency with medium armor, shields, and martial weapons. So that means we're going to have better armor class than other warlocks, and we can also use better weapons than other warlocks can. The second, and this is also a really big deal, is the influence of your patron also allows you to mystically channel your will through a particular weapon. Whenever you finish a long rest, you can touch one weapon that you're proficient with and lacks the two-handed property. That's why we're using a hand crossbow. When you attack with that weapon, you use your charisma modifier instead of your strength or dexterity for the attack and damage rolls. This benefit lasts until you finish a long rest. So basically, you can pick one weapon and you can have it up all the time. And then you can just switch off that weapon if you need to, if other weapons become available to you. If you later gain the Pact of the Blade feature, which we will, this benefit extends to every Pact weapon you conjure with that feature, no matter the weapon's type. So that means we can now do two weapons. We can do our Pact weapon plus another weapon that doesn't have the two-handed property. That means we can do both a ranged weapon and a melee weapon. So if we look at our character at level 1, this is a little skewed because I've added those equipment things that we want to have. So this is showing an armor class of 17. If you're wearing leather armor, you have an armor class of 13. But it's very reasonable that you can get up to scale mail reasonably quickly. That would give you an armor class of 16 because scale mail is not expensive. In fact, if you roll for your starting equipment, there's a fairly good chance you're going to be able to afford scale mail right off the bat. And here's our hand crossbow, plus 5 to hit, 1d6 plus 3 damage. That's because it is our hex weapon. Now, again, a hand crossbow, maybe you can't afford it right away. So if you can't afford it right away, my backup suggestion would be to use the sling. The sling doesn't have the two-handed property. It's also ranged, and we're just looking at a d4 base damage instead of d6. That's not good damage, but at level 1, we're still adding a charisma bonus. We could still add something like a hex, so we could still actually do reasonably decent damage with this. And if we're throwing our hex curse on top of that, we're also adding our proficiency bonus. So suddenly it's a d4, which is 2.5 plus 3 for your charisma, so that's 5.5 plus 2 for your proficiency bonus, that's 7.5 plus 3.5 from a hex. Now we're looking at 11 average damage with a sling at level 1. And then with a hand crossbow, it becomes 12. Then we've got our rapier as a backup. It's a plus 4 to hit. Not great, but not terrible. And a d8 plus 2 damage. Again, not great, but not terrible. If I get stuck in melee, it's a reasonable option. Draw your rapier and stab. And because we don't have anything in our offhand at this moment, you could have your rapier out in your offhand and attack with it and then just put it away. Because we started off with that nice constitution, we have 11 starting hit points, and we have a plus 3 constitution modifier. So what I want to do here is I want to jump up to level 3. Now we're going to start with our Pact boon, and we're going to take Pact of the Blade. This is going to allow us to conjure a weapon, and that weapon will automatically be considered a Hexblade weapon. So then we get 2 Eldritch invocations. Now something to remember about Eldritch invocations is we can switch them off as we gain levels, just as we can switch off known spells. So that is useful because some of the good invocations aren't available yet. So we can switch off invocations we took earlier to get those invocations later on. But one invocation we're going to keep right through is Improved Pact Weapon. So number 1, you can use any weapon you summon with your Pact of the Blade features a spellcasting focus for your Warlock spells. Now we have a component pouch and we would probably have a hand free when we need it. So that's actually not such a big deal, but it's always nice. And in addition, the weapon gains a plus 1 bonus to its attack and damage rolls unless it's a magic weapon that already has a bonus to those rolls. So that means right at level 3, we are guaranteed to have a plus 1 weapon. Finally, the weapon you can conjure can be a short bow, long bow, light crossbow, or heavy crossbow. So at this level, actually a good choice here is a heavy crossbow. That's a d10 damage, and it becomes our Pact weapon. And because it's our Pact weapon, we get to use our charisma for attack and damage. When we get to level 5, we will want to switch that to a longbow. The second invocation I'm going to take is Misty Visions. I like the Misty Visions invocation. It lets you use Silent Image. an unlimited number of times. So suddenly, all those limits on spellcasting, as long as we're casting Silent Image, not a concern. We can cast over and over again. Now, Silent Image uses our concentration, so we can only have one up at a time, but we can have one up at a time. Misty Visions isn't an invocation I'm going to want to keep for long because better options are going to come up that fit this character. But at this level, it works just fine. So we're going to get 2 additional spells at this level, and now we're casting 2nd level spells. We also have 2 Pact slots. I'm liking Mirror Image here and Misty Step. Misty Step, of course, is a teleport that uses a bonus action. It can allow you to get out of melee when you need to. And then Mirror Image is basically going to turn 3 attacks into misses that would have been hits otherwise. So a nice maneuverability spell and a nice defensive spell. Now, Mirror Image takes an action to cast, so it is really something that you only want to do if you have a chance to prepare for a combat. For now, I'm going to keep my shield spell and my hex spell. Still both useful spells at this level. I'm probably not going to use shield as much, but I'm still going to be using hex reasonably often just because that extra d6 damage is useful, and it's really the only way I have to add yet another point of damage onto my character. So if we look at our character at level 3, it's doing just fine. I mean, we've got a decent armor class. We have a pretty good number of hit points. With 2 Pact spells, we can think if we're going to even short rest once a day, we'll get 4 castings. And we can use one of them for a hex. Then we can use one for a mirror image if it's available. If not, a shield will work in a pinch. And then maybe a Misty Step if we are in a position where we are getting caught in melee. So all useful ways to keep ourselves safe, to keep ourselves in position. So I've switched out our main weapon to a heavy crossbow. Heavy crossbow, we're looking at a +6 to hit, 1d10 plus 4 damage. That's including it as a Pact weapon because we're getting that +1 to hit and damage from our improved Pact weapon invocation. But in addition, of course, we can do things like a Hexblade Curse to add an additional +2 damage. We can add a Hex spell to do additional 3.5 points of damage. So 5.5 from the main weapon, +4 is 9.5, +2 from the proficiency bonus is 11.5, +3.5. Now we're looking at 15 average damage at level 3. That's not bad at all. So we're going to jump up to level 5, and this is where this build is going to come together. We get an ability score improvement, and we're going to take a feat here. And the feat we're going to take is the Elven Accuracy feat. Now what this is going to allow us to do is, number 1, it's going to allow us to increase our charisma by a point. So that's going to get our charisma to 18. And second, whenever we have advantage on an attack roll using dexterity, intelligence, wisdom, or charisma, you can re-roll one of the dice once. So we want to be doing a lot of attacks with advantage. We get a new Eldritch invocation option. And what we're going to do here is we're going to take Thirsting Blade. That gives us our 2nd attack. So important. So now's the time to switch to Longbow, get those 2 attacks around. And finally, we're going to switch off our Misty Visions invocation, and we're going to switch it to Devil's Sight. Devil's Sight allows us to see in darkness, both magical and non-magical, to a distance of 120 feet. We have another cantrip available. I'm going to take the Mage Hand cantrip. Useful cantrip, and I've talked about this before. It's basically telekinesis. Very useful spell to have. Now we get 2 additional spells. There's lots of good spells to choose from. We're looking at 3rd level spells. I want to have the counter spell with this character and dispel magic. We're going to worry a little bit less about offensive spells because we are using our weapon for offense. Now we could look at something like elemental weapon, but actually hex is still a good choice to be casting at this level. See, when we use the hex spell using a 3rd level slot, we can maintain our concentration for up to 8 hours. So that means you can cast your hex at the beginning of your adventuring day, and then when you take your first short rest, you're going to get that slot back, but you can keep the hex up, which we can do as long as we're not worrying about concentrating on anything else. Nice thing about Counterspell and Dispel Magic, both powerful spells, both useful spells. Neither are going to use your concentration. Neither is our shield spell. Neither is our Misty Step. So we're going to have lots of spell options that aren't going to use our concentration, allowing us to maintain a concentration on a hex spell. But there is one thing we can do that is going to be using our concentration, and that is we can cast the Darkness spell. We can do this using our Drow ability. And then when we cast the Darkness spell on ourselves, we'll be encapsulated in a magical darkness, which means we can't be seen and we can't see. Or normally we couldn't see. But because we have Devil's Sight, we can see just fine. Now, it's important to remember when you're using this combination, darkness isn't always party friendly. So where you're positioned compared to the rest of the party becomes pretty important. So we definitely don't want to be screwing our other party members. Always be a good player who's nice to your fellow players. But if we're careful here and in the right environments, we can use this to get a permanent advantage on our enemies, while they get permanent disadvantage against us. Now, darkness lasts for 10 minutes, which means it will definitely last an entire combat. It should last multiple combats for you, depending on kind of the situation, but as long as your encounters are reasonably close together, you should be able to use darkness over multiple combats. And it has a 15-foot radius around you. So that means if we're looking at a 30-foot range for our Hexblade Curse, we can easily come into range to hit with our Hexblade Curse without necessarily covering allies that maybe are in melee with that enemy. So that's kind of how we want to use this. We want to be a little bit back so that we're not hitting our allies with the darkness because we don't want to screw them over, even though there's a certain defensive advantage for them too. And you can use that tactically. If a fellow party member is in trouble, you can go over them with the darkness, and that will help protect them because it will give disadvantage to attacks against them. It'll also prevent them from being targeted by spells. You will also have that protection. So if we look at our character now, we've got our longbow. It is a +8 to hit, but we're going to be doing that with advantage with 3 dice. So we're going to hit all the time. Now if we use our Hexblade Curse, that means 2 attacks, 3 dice each, 19 to 20 crit range. That means you're going to crit a lot. Damage is 1d8 plus 5 plus an additional 3 if we throw our Hexblade Curse on there. So that's 1d8 plus 8. And then it'll be 2d8 plus 8 on a crit. So that's not huge crit damage yet. That will come at level 7. So let's bring this bad boy to level 7. And now we get one more Eldritch invocation, and this is the key. We are going to take Eldritch Smite, and I talked about this at the beginning of the video. This can be added to our ranged weapon. So now we can attack with permanent advantage, with 3 dice on that advantage, with a crit range of 19 to 20, which means we're going to crit all the time. And when we crit, if it's a powerful enemy, we're going to use one of our Pact slots to do an Eldritch Smite. So when we use an Eldritch Smite at this level, it is going to be using a 4th level slot, which means 5d8 additional damage, in addition to knocking them over. But because we'll be applying it only when we get criticals, that becomes 10d8. That's an additional 45 points of damage. Now if you think about 45 points of damage, plus the 2d8 you're going to get from the longbow, that's another 9 points of damage. So now we're talking about 54 points of damage plus our bonuses. And a big thing happens at 7th level as well as we get 4th level spells. And there's a specific spell we want to grab, and that is Shadow of Moil. As I mentioned, combining Devil's Sight plus Darkness is effective, but it cannot always be party friendly. Shadow of Moil is a great way for you to get that advantage without it being a problem for the party. It is a 1 action cast. It only lasts a minute, so this is a one combat spell. Flame like shadows wreathe your body until the spell ends, causing you to become heavily obscured to others. Heavily obscured means they have a disadvantage to attack you, and you will have advantage to attack them. Shadows turn dim light within 10 feet of you into darkness, and bright light into dim light. Until the spell ends, you have resistance to radiant damage. In addition, whenever a creature within 10 feet of you hits you with an attack, the shadows lash out at that creature, dealing an additional 2d8 necrotic damage. Big thing here is it gives us the same advantage of the darkness plus the Devil's Sight without being a problem for our party. Also, it gives us another method to create that permanent advantage, which is going to take advantage of our Elven accuracy, which is going to take advantage of our Hexblade Curse, and the ability to do a Hex Smite. Now, if we cast Shadow of Moil, that leaves us 1 Smite, so this is really kind of a one-shot thing. We're going to do the Shadow of Moil, get permanent advantage, get lots of criticals, do decent damage all the time, but when we fight that one big enemy and we want to hit him with a huge amount of damage, we can do that. Or stick with the Darkness, and maybe you can use more than 1 Eldritch Smite. I'm also going to grab Dimension Door here. Dimension Door is just a better spell than Misty Step. Now normally I like to use Misty Step because it's using a 2nd level slot, but if I'm using Pact Magic and I need to teleport, A Dimension Door will allow me to bring somebody else. It'll allow me to go somewhere I can't see, and it will allow me to go a lot further distance. I'm going to keep Misty Step just because it is a bonus action, but I will probably be trading out Misty Step reasonably soon. What I am going to trade out is Shield. Shield is a great spell, but I do not want to be using a 4th level slot on a Shield spell. Much better that I go ahead and just take a really good 4th level spell instead. I'm going to take Hallucinatory Terrain. It's a good spell. Now, I'm going to be taking a lot of spells here, and I may never cast them. So I'm taking them because I have the slots, but I don't have the slots to cast them, especially when I'm using Eldritch Smite. So although I'm taking a bunch of spells here, they're there if I need them, but I probably want to avoid casting them unless there's an emergency situation. So this character can do a lot of damage now. Even if we're not using our Darkness, even if we're not using our Eldritch Smites, the longbow with a d8 plus 5 damage, that's assuming a non-magical longbow. As soon as you get a magical longbow, it's going to go up from there. And then we can just do a simple hex spell on top of there, and it will last all day if we want to do that. And then save those big Darkness plus Devil's Sight for the big fights. That means a d8 plus a d6 plus 5 damage, plus we got a Hexblade Curse that we can use every short rest. We have decent hit points and decent defense, so we have a lot of different things going for us here. We also at this point have that Accursed Specter. I talked about that beforehand. Again, it's not a huge thing, but it's fun, and I will take it. So we're going to jump this to level 9. We are going to get another ability score improvement, and at this point I'm going to take the Sharpshooter feat. Sharpshooter is going to give us the advantage of being able to ignore cover, but in addition it's going to do plus 10 damage on each attack. Now this isn't multiplied on a critical, but we're doing advantage with Elven accuracy on our attacks. That's going to give us hits and hits and hits even with that minus 5 easy, so we might as well take an additional plus 10 damage. Now I should say some people are going to say, what about Crossbow Expert? Because Crossbow Expert you could use to, number one, get out of melee if you need to, but of course if we're using our Darkness or our Shadows of Moil, we can get out of melee easy enough. The second thing they would point out is that we can use our bonus action to make an additional attack with a hand crossbow, but there's 2 limiting factors here. The first is you're stuck with a hand crossbow, and we're at the level where magic weapons are starting to be found. Do we want to be stuck limiting ourselves to a hand crossbow when we're more likely to find magical longbows? Now, if I found a great magical crossbow, even like a light crossbow or a heavy crossbow, I would jump on Crossbow Expert here, just to avoid the loading property, because then I could use that weapon and be able to get my multiple attacks every round. So there's a little bit dependent here. Sharpshooter, assuming we're sticking with longbow. So the invocation I'm going to take is Maddening Hex. Maddening Hex is just a way to do a little bit more damage. As a bonus action, you cause a psychic disturbance around a target cursed by your hex spell, so that'll happen reasonably often, or by a Warlock feature of yours, such as the Hexblade Curse or Sign of Ill Omen. Of course, we're using Hexblade Curse, so when you do so, you deal psychic damage to the cursed target and each creature of your choice that you can see within 5 feet of it. Psychic damage equals your charisma modifier, minimum of 1 damage. To use this invocation, you must be able to see the cursed target, and it must be within 30 feet of you. So again, that 30-foot limit, which is where we are to do the Hexblade Curse in the first place. Now, I'm not always going to have bonus actions available. I'm using a bonus action if I want to do a hex, and I'm doing a bonus action if I want to switch that hex, and I'm doing a bonus action if I want to do a Hexblade Curse. So there's lots of times I won't have a bonus action, but there's lots of times I will. Let's say I've used that bonus action and I've set up my Hexblade Curse, and now I'm just doing the damage straight out from my Darkness spell. Well, then I'm not using my bonus action for anything, so that just gives me 4 additional damage every round, plus the possibility to hit more than one creature with it. It's not a great invocation, but at this level, it's about as good as I'm going to get. I could go back to something like Misty Visions, but I can't really afford the concentration. The next really great invocation I'm going to get is at level 12. We now get 5th level spells. This is the highest level of Pact magic we're ever going to get. We are, after this, going to switch to what they call Mystic Arcanum. Mystic Arcanum are basically high-level spells with a single-level slot, and you get them back with a long rest, just like a regular spellcaster would get. I'm not sure why they don't use just spell slots for it. They call it Mystic Arcanum instead. One thing that's nice about Mystic Arcanum is they will not use our Pact slots. And we have our Pact slots all used up by Eldritch Smites and by Shadows of Moil. So this will give us a chance as we move on to be able to cast spells again. But at this point, we're going to have 2 5th level spells to choose from. Again, I'm probably using those 5th level slots for Eldritch Smites. That is 68 damage, which will become 12d8 when we add it to a critical hit. So the 2 spells I'm going to take here are Synaptic Static and Dream. Now, Dream is kind of just to fill in. This is more of a non-combat spell, maybe an off-time spell. So it gives us the ability, we can use this to communicate with somebody like across the world, a little bit like a sending spell, except you can actually have a conversation. It's not a ritual. It's not something I'm going to cast very often. It's really kind of just a fill-in spell. But all my spells are pretty much fill-in spells at this point, and I could see using this outside of actual adventuring, which is when I'll actually have Pact Magic available. So for those reasons, I think it's actually an okay selection in this particular case. Synaptic Static is a way for us to do some damage in an area, which is something that Warlocks aren't very good at. But this one's a good spell. It does 8d6 damage, which is like fireball damage. But it is psychic, it requires an intelligence saving throw, and anyone who fails doesn't just take damage, they're also debuffed at that point. They're going to take a d6 minus to all their attack rolls and ability checks and constitution saving throws to maintain concentration. So lots of little debuffs from this as well. It's a lovely little spell. I don't know how many slots we're going to have available to cast it, but it's there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do our jump from 9th level to 10th level, then to 11th level, then to 12th level. We'll do them one at a time, but we'll do them reasonably quick, and you can just kind of see the things that layer on here. So at level 10, we get our Armor of Hex's ability. What happens is when a target is cursed by our Hexblade curse, so that's the big bad guy, right? When they hit us with an attack roll, we can use our reaction roll to roll a d6. On a 4 or higher, the attack instead misses you, regardless of its roll. So basically, it's a 50-50 chance to turn an attack against you from the big bad guy into a miss. It's not a great ability, but it's okay. And we get another cantrip. And let's go ahead and take Prestidigitation. I've talked about it lots of times. You know what it does. And it's fun. And this is the kind of level where if we're going to take cantrips, we might as well take the ones that are fun. So that's it for level 10. Not a lot there. Let's jump to level 11. Now we get our Mystic Arcanum. This is a 6th level spell that does not use a Pact slot. So that's lovely. It's a great spell that we're going to be able to cast without it affecting what makes us great in the first place. There are a few good options here, but I want to choose something that isn't going to use my concentration because I'm always going to be concentrating on something. So Soul Cage is a reasonable option. Create Undead is a reasonable option. But I'm going to go ahead and take my usual Mass Suggestion. A lovely non-concentration spell, mass effect, not going to use a Pact slot, can do it once a day, terrific. Another big thing that happens at 11th level is we get a 3rd Pact spell. So a 3rd Pact spell means a 3rd Eldritch Smite. That is terrific because we will be able to use it. And remember, this isn't 3 smites a day. This is 3 smites per short rest. So if we're getting, say, 2, I usually guess there's going to be 2 short rests. It depends on campaigns. Some campaigns almost never get a short rest. Others get 1, some get 2, some get as many as they want. So I usually use 2 as an average. So if we assume 2, that's 9 Eldritch Smites per day, and they're all going to be applied to criticals. Finally, let's go to level 12. So we get one more invocation here, and what we are going to take is Life Drinker. When we hit a creature with our Pact weapon, the creature takes extra necrotic damage equal to your charisma modifier. So that is charisma bonus to damage with every arrow. Terrific. And we get an ability score improvement. Obviously, we could talk about Crossbow Expert, but we're going to increase our charisma here. This is increasing so many things for us right now. It's increasing our to hit. It is increasing our damage twice because we're getting it both from the Hex weapon and from our Life Drinker ability. So this is a +2 damage and a +1 to hit. Never mind the fact we're improving our spell DC for things like that Mass Suggestion spell we just picked up. So this isn't that complicated. Using our Darkness and Devil's Sight or Shadows of Moil, we can get ourselves permanent advantage on attacks. We're attacking twice a round. Those attacks will be with advantage using Elven accuracy, meaning we're going to get 3 dice. We can use a Hexblade curse once per short rest to give us a 19 to 20 critical threat range. It also increases our damage by a proficiency bonus. So when we have a big enemy, then we're using this darkness plus Devil's Sight or the Shadows of Moil, and then we put the Hexblade curse on them. Even if we have a non-magical longbow, that's plus 10 to hit with 3 dice. So we're always going to hit, and we're often going to crit, because if any of those 3 dice are a 19 or 20, it's a critical hit. So with 2 attacks a round, we're pretty much always going to hit twice a round, and critical hits are going to happen reasonably often. Maybe not every round, but a lot of the time. Our base damage with our longbow is a d8 plus 6, but remember we're going to have Life Drinker on top of that, so suddenly it's d8 plus 11. And then when we're using our Hexblade Curse, our current proficiency bonus is plus 4, so that d8 plus 6 becomes d8 plus 11 becomes d8 plus 15. Then if we add Sharpshooter, it becomes d8 plus 25. And then add 12d8 to damage to that whenever we score a critical hit, because we're going to be throwing on our Eldritch Smite, plus the d8 additional damage from the longbow. Now, in those few situations where we're maybe not using darkness, we can throw up a hex. We can have that hex last all day at this point, and that hex would mean 2d8 plus 2d6 damage. Not too bad. Now, despite having that great damage potential, we still are a caster. There are a number of spells we have the ability to cast. Now, whenever we're using a Pact spell, remember that's one less Eldritch Smite, so we're giving up something for the ability to cast that spell. But once we get Mystic Arcanum, then we are going to have spells we can cast that don't cost us anything except for that one slot, which we weren't going to use for anything else. So that is very useful as a way to make this character more and more of a spellcaster who also uses a bow. So we really get that flavor we didn't necessarily get, because with the Eldritch Knight, that character was really one note. It uses a bow, it uses it very, very well. And it has magic, but that magic primarily affects its ability to use that bow or straight out defense or mobility. This character has some neat different stuff it can do. It's going to have that, maybe that Accursed Specter. It's going to be able to do mass suggestion. It can use a Pact spell for something else. It has so many slots. We could switch them all up if we wanted to, because we have a ton of spells known at this point. Even though we don't necessarily have the slots we're going to use for those spells, we're going to generally use them for smites. Now, people are going to be asking me, if I level this up to level 20, what should I be taking with my Mystic Arcanum slots? Good question. I think at level 7, the obvious choice is Force Cage. Force Cage works terrifically here because it doesn't use your concentration, and it's a kind of spell you didn't have before, and we know it's a great spell. And you want to finish off that creature in the Force Cage, well, good thing you're an amazing archer. At the 8th level slot, I'd like to go a little different here. I'm thinking Demi-Plane is kind of interesting. I was just kind of thinking about it, and you could put a bunch of prisoners in a demi-plane, and then you could go, grab one out and kill him and get your Accursed Specter each day. Just a little exploit I was kind of considering. Now, you would have to be able to keep them alive in that demi-plane, but it's a thought. But demi-plane is also a useful spell in other ways as well. It's a great home base for a party, a great place to store magic stuff, and there's not a lot of great 8th level options for Warlock, so I think it's a nice fit for you there. And 9th level, Foresight, right? Obviously Foresight. Then you're going to cast that. You're going to switch out your Devil's Sight, because you're never going to use that darkness thing again, because you're going to have advantage all the time. And enemies are always going to have disadvantage against you, and you don't need to do any tricks to get it. At 14th level, you're going to get your Master of Hexes, which is your capstone ability for Hexblade. I think it's okay. We are largely relying on our Hexblade Curse with this character in particular. So for us, I think it's actually better than it is for maybe the average Hexblade. Because what it allows us to do is when we kill a creature with our Hexblade Curse, which we're often going to do because those criticals are going to do so much damage, it's often going to kill that enemy. We can then switch that Hexblade Curse to another enemy and then maybe crit them and kill them too. So for us, I think it's actually a pretty good capstone. Now, with future ability score improvements, I think I would definitely find some way to mitigate concentration saves. We're largely relying on this particular build to avoid being hit because we're getting disadvantage on those attacks. But you can be hit some of the times. You can't avoid damage altogether, and that means concentration saves. And you have a good constitution, but it's not proficient. So I would be thinking something like Resilient Con comes into play later on, or maybe even Warcaster or Lucky. There's also always the possibility of that crossbow expert feat, especially if you get your hands on a nice magical crossbow. Then there can be some nice synergy there. For invocations at higher levels, I like Shroud of Shadow. It's going to give you invisibility at will. So that's more ways that we can go in and find other ways to move around without using the darkness or our Pact spells. I also like Visions of the Distant Realms. Arcane Eye is a good spell, and being able to do it at will is pretty good too. And then the capstone for Warlock at level 20 is Eldritch Master. That allows you to use a 1 minute to get back all your Pact spells. So it's like a 1 minute short rest recovery. You can only do it once a day. At that point, you can have 4 Pact spells. So that's 8 Pact spells in the space of one short rest, which means potentially 8 Eldritch Smites, or maybe you want to do 4 Eldritch Smites and 4 actual spells. So again, as a capstone, I think it's decent. It's not one of the better capstones in the game, but it's okay. So that's kind of a guide as to what I would do with this character at level 20, or as we move to level 20. But the character I'm going to be linking in the video description is the 12th level build. This is where I think this build really is strong, where it really kind of reaches its maximum potential. So as I said, if you're playing a character that's going to go in a campaign that's going to get to level 12, I think this is a really strong option if you want to play an archer who does a lot of damage and maybe has some spell options besides. Now, if we're talking about just doing as much damage as possible, as often as possible, and up to as high a level as possible, check out my Ultimate Archer video. That's the build for you, the straight Eldritch Knight. But Hexblade, again, as a straight class, I don't think this is a bad option. I think, yeah, Hexblade makes a great first level dip just because it has that front loaded feature. Or maybe even a 3-level dip just because Warlock brings on quite a lot in those first 3 levels. But after that, I still think this is a good build. Now, because we're not playing a wizard, we're not going to be casting and casting and casting. We have a couple spells, and we're going to be using them largely for smites, but we have the ability to cast other spells. And then again, if we take our half drow, we have additional abilities to cast more spells, which is why I think that's such a good race for this particular build. So I hope you like this build. More builds to come. I get so many suggestions for builds. I would like to tackle them all, but it might take me some time to do so. Plus, I have some my own ideas for builds I want to do as well. And I know everyone talks to me about wizard builds all the time. They're coming. They're coming. I'm not sure what's coming first. I'm getting a lot of talk about Blade Singer, so I might do Blade Singer first. And it will be a straight Blade Singer, not a multi-class. So, we'll see when that happens. Until then, I'm going to sit back and I am going to relax and I'm going to have some fun because D&D is for everyone. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you next time.